So the first session of our series is called Carbon Markets, the Basics. And we will be getting into a lot more than just the basics today, but this is going to be the foundational session that will help guide the discussion throughout the series. As some of you may know, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, recently released the 6th assessment report, and the report offers an urgent message that the time for action is now. The report identifies rapid pathways needed for cutting global emissions by half before the end of the decade. Also, the California Air Resources Board is also updating its scoping plan to map out the state strategies needed to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045. Carbon neutrality means balancing our sources of emissions with carbon sinks, or things that remove carbon from the atmosphere. One thing is clear: achieving carbon neutrality will ultimately require offsetting emissions that we cannot mitigate or reduce otherwise. Whether this is at the scale of an individual project, an entire organization, a whole community, carbon offsets will increasingly become a part of everyone's climate action toolkit. But what are offsets and how do they work? Who creates them? Do they actually reduce emissions? How much do they cost to create or purchase? And how can we support local carbon projects and offsets? We all have these questions too. We are local governments, air pollution control districts, and nonprofits seeking ways to initiate and expand local sequestration projects so that way we can meet local, regional, and global carbon goals. But we are not experts. Over the past 2 years, we have met as a working group, brainstormed ideas, interviewed practitioners, and ventured grant applications. As we researched and built our knowledge, we decided the next step was to share beyond our group to the larger community. And thus we created this webinar series. At this moment, I would like to pause and thank our webinar organizers. While this series has a bit of a Central Coast flair, we recognize that the universal applicability of what will be shared over the 5 weeks will benefit everyone. Over the first 4 sessions of the series will go deep into carbon markets, sequestration, and offset projects, and how the resulting GHG benefits are used. Today's session will cover the basic and advanced inner workings of carbon offset markets. Session 2 will go deeper into the protocols, the market actors, and considerations of the supply side of the carbon market. The third session will explore the demand side considerations of carbon markets through the perspectives of a local government, a university, and a project developer consultant. Session 4 will go beyond carbon markets to explore ways in which land stewards are already caring for the land through regenerative stewardship and how non-market programs can support them. And our final session is designed as an interactive discussion, offering an opportunity for series participants to engage in open discussion, debrief their takeaways, and consider the existing and future needs and resources to facilitate local carbon sequestration projects and offsets. This last session is not a webinar like the first 4 sessions, so it does require a separate registration. While this series focuses on carbon offsets and carbon sequestration projects, we recognize that they are not the only solution to meeting carbon neutrality or supporting land stewardship, nor should they be. This series is not an endorsement of any particular solution, approach, or company. It is meant to be a compilation of practitioners who will share their experience and perspectives on this complex topic. We hope this series will increase your awareness and the interest in possibilities of facilitating local carbon sequestration and offset projects as a ways to improve land management and stimulate economic development. We also want to thank our two event hosts, the Central Coast Climate Collaborative and the Santa Barbara County Regional Climate Collaborative. Both collaboratives are growing networks for public agencies, nonprofits, businesses, and community-based organizations seeking to collaborate in addressing our region's climate challenges. We invite you to visit and learn more about each collaborative to find ways to engage. And now let's get on to today's program, Carbon Markets, the Basics. Not only are we going to be covering the basics, we are going deep into the offsite world so that we all can better appreciate the complexities of the market and how best to engage them. I won't spend too much time introducing our speakers because they'll be able to introduce themselves, and we really want to get into the content that they're presenting on. So I'll just introduce our first speaker, who is John McDougal from Element Markets, which recently merged with BlueSource. John is the Vice President of Environmental Projects. So welcome, John.
Thank you, Garrett. As Garrett's kind of loading up my section of the slides, I can just give you a quick background on myself. I've been working in the carbon markets for just over 10 years now, doing everything from development of offset projects to asset management to managing the registration, verification, validation, all the way down to the marketing and monetization of the credits, so upstream and downstream. And I'll give a quick overview of our company, but my focus has been over the last decade to be in both compliance and voluntary markets, and specifically within CEQA, working with different CEQA practitioners to better educate on the offset market and to ultimately deliver offsets for offsite mitigation for CEQA. That's obviously one type of demand source in the offset markets, but I'll go over, overall the overarching kind of demand side as well as the supply side of offsets in this presentation. So, the general kind of takeaway from this first part is really to give you the basics, as Garrett said, of what is an offset, what's the application of an offset, what is the state of the market. And what in the context of what I think the audience is looking for as far as how it interplays with CEQA and kind of some of the dynamics of the market today. I'll go over that, and so it'll be about 15 to 20 minutes to go through. So, Garrett, next slide, please. So I won't spend too much time on our company, but just as a general overview, we are the largest environmental commodity provider in North America. We recently, as Garrett said, merged with BlueSource. That was an announcement that we gave 4 weeks ago. That essentially brought over a firm that's been in the markets as long as we have, that specializes in nature-based and regen ag development. So it complemented our services, and we're really excited about that announcement and merger. Outside of carbon, we do a number of other, we're involved in a number of other markets, including RNG, renewable energy certificates, the low carbon fuel standard, which is in California, and the emission credit markets, which are criteria pollutants. And just in general, we focused in North America on carbon, but our portfolio does range across the globe, generating credits in every continent except Australia and Antarctica. Next slide, Garrett. So this is just a breakdown into carbon. So just as kind of quickly, I kind of went over this already, but some highlights here is that we've been operating since really 2005, transacted over 135 million tons, and have done that upstream, downstream side of offsets, both in the voluntary and compliance markets, which I'll cover here in the next slide. But we work with a number of types of entities, including corporates, universities, municipalities, helping to educate on offsets, how they can complement their decarbonization goals and not replace them, but complement them, and essentially bring forward a true, verifiable, real mitigation measure for decarbonization and environmental social governance. Next slide. So I always like to start with this slide with carbon kind of basics. If you've ever been online and you've looked for carbon offsets, it's a maze to look through. It can be difficult to kind of pinpoint, what pricing is and how it transactions, what's the difference between one market versus the other. And the answer is that it is very fragmented, it's balkanized, and it can be confusing at times. But the one way to think about it in general from a 10,000-foot view is that there are compliance markets and voluntary markets that exist in the world today. In the US, there are two primary compliance markets for carbon. That is the one that exists in California under AB 398, previously AB 32, for cap and trade that involves different types of carbon instruments, including carbon offsets or California compliance offsets. And that is an economy-wide cap and trade program. There is also a cap and trade program that is power specific in the Northeast that covers Northeastern states for power facilities that have at or greater 25 megawatts of capacity. So those are the two compliance markets that exist today. I've also listed some ones outside of the US. And the takeaway here is, if you see off to the left on the table here, you have compliance programs and voluntary programs, all priced differently. They all have their different supply and demand fundamentals, different requirements, guardrails. And so from a commercial standpoint, to be able to understand that and what impacts price is important. Fundamentally, though, as I said, at the high level, compliance markets and voluntary markets are fundamentally different on the commercial side, but very similar in generating offsets. And we'll go over that process that really is comparable to both compliance offsets and voluntary offsets. One question that I always get when it comes to CEQA is, and on the buyer side, especially on the demand side, is what's the difference between a California compliance offset and a voluntary offset? And there really is fundamentally no difference in generating that offset, other than that the CARB, or California Air Resources Board, is involved in the final issuance of credits, and they're essentially the governing body, versus the registries or the voluntary offset registries that also play a role in the compliance markets as far as adding resources to ARB and screening projects up front before ARB's review. But in the voluntary market, again, they are the ultimate governing body for the integrity of the program, the offsets, and we'll go over that a little bit in detail later. Next slide. So an offset, again, it is at its basic level is 1 metric ton of CO2 reduced, or a sequestered, or another term for that, a popular term today, or removed. In terms of regen ag and agricultural reforestation projects, there is a removal element of sequestering CO2 out of the atmosphere versus avoiding emissions, say in different types of projects like a landfill methane capture project or improved forest management project that keeps acreage of forest in place, or that carbon stock in place. So the takeaway from the slide really is there can be many different types of projects that generate offsets that can be registered. But the fundamental unit or denominator is 1 metric ton of CO2 equivalent. That is the currency. Next slide. So here is, on the top side of this slide, is really, it kind of follows or segues from what I just said, is that the idea behind offset projects is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions on a voluntary basis, irrespective of its compliance markets or a voluntary market. And the greenhouse gases that are listed here as examples can be ones that are avoided or sequestered and then normalized to 1 metric ton of CO2 equivalent. So the top side of the slide is just to say, for example, a methane molecule that is what it otherwise emitted to atmosphere, if an offset project captures that and destroys it, they are reducing those emissions by a factor of 25, or another term to use is the global warming potential of that. And that just gives you a snapshot of how calculations are done, that if you're capturing a greenhouse gas, everything again is in currency of 1 metric ton of CO2 equivalent. More importantly on this slide is the bottom. And this is a universal requirements for all offsets, irrespective of project type. These 5 principles prevail on all protocols, whether they're compliance or whether they're voluntary. And I'll go over these briefly, but it's important to understand that these are fundamental in every offset project. Real essentially means that there is the project activity is measured or is in accordance with a scientifically based, publicly reviewed or peer-reviewed protocol that is essentially created or adopted by a carbon offset registry. Okay? Additional, very important for offset projects is that the project must show that it goes above and beyond business as usual from a regulatory standpoint. So the activity for reduction can't be required by any federal, state, or local requirements. In addition to that, you have to demonstrate that the activity goes above and beyond what is business as usual. So they're within embedded in protocols and registries are additionality tests or performance standards to demonstrate from a project proponent standpoint or project developer of an offset project standpoint, how your project is going above and beyond business as usual. You can show that you're overcoming a financial barrier due to your activity by the receipt of carbon revenue or carbon offset revenue. There's common practice barriers that you can demonstrate, but it's important to the registry and all stakeholders and whoever's involved in the process, whether you're a seller or a buyer, that all offsets that are registered and certified are additional. And there is a process for demonstrating that. Verifiable, all projects must be third-party verified and validated. Typically that's done on an annual basis, but can have exceptions to that. That's an ANSI accredited or ISO accredited third-party verifier that's approved by a registry. Enforceable, this is a little bit different in certain definitions, but essentially what this means is that there's undisputed ownership of offsets and that there's clear title of the reductions and the claims. So key word there is reductions. When there is an offset that's created and it's generated, there needs to be clear title from the seller. And then when it's sold to a buyer, they're relinquishing or conveying that title to the buyer and that claim for that reduction. So that seller can no longer claim that reduction and no other third party can either. That is very important and fundamental to all offset projects. There's no double counting. Permanent, so very important in nature-based, not so much of an issue in certain emission reduction activities like destroying methane, because the methane molecule can't be reversed back into methane after it's been converted to CO2. But for instance, in nature-based or regen ag, permanence is a question that comes up all the time. And as they're developing protocols on how are you ensuring that the CO2 is staying sequestered in the soil as you move through generations or owners of that acreage, or your transitioning practices, what have you. It's very important that you establish permanence, and that is defined in the existing protocols. Okay, next slide. So here is the kind of take a step back. We just talked about the principles of offsets. There's protocols, there's registries. We'll go over to registries in a little bit, but thinking about fundamentally, what is an offset? What does it do for you as a tool? Well, one, it is a complement and a cost-effective option to help meet sustainability targets. It can help shape a goal that you have that maybe you're reducing internally, but you need to meet some threshold that's for emissions that are unavoidable or residual. You can use offsets as a function or a product to meet those goals. They are fully bankable. They do not expire, meaning that you can hold credits that are issued and they do not expire or they don't have a shelf life until you retire them. Now, retire is just another word for use them against emissions. So that is a fundamental element of offsets, in that it's a fungible product. You can move it around until it's retired. It can be bought, it can be sold. It has appreciation, depreciation value until you retire it. Okay. And then lastly, here off to the right, you'll see some sustainable development goals. Offsets also have co-benefits associated with that. And those are, you may have read, through CEQA and others, that co-benefits is important to certain lead agencies and audiences there. And that beyond the emission reduction, what economic, social impact does it have? And these are something that we list all the time in our offset projects. And they're also listed for on the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. Always important for a buyer, a lot of times, is to have those co-benefits associated with it. Okay, next slide. So here is just going over a very general high-level flow diagram of an offset development process here off to the right. Off to the left is listing some primary carbon offset registries. I've listed the 4 primaries that exist today that have been doing offsets or registering offsets for many years. Those 4 are American Carbon Registry, Climate Action Reserve, Gold Standard, and Verra. The American Carbon Registry, Climate Action Reserve, and Verra are CARB-approved registries, and they do provide the resources to ARB to generate California compliance offsets. But they also have the voluntary offset protocols and the credits that are registered in those programs. But essentially, they have 2 primary functions. They manage the process for developing protocols by putting forth or creating working groups, different professional scientists on a specific protocol or activity, and adopt those protocols, and then administer and govern the registration of projects, verification, validation under those protocols. Secondly, they provide the tracking function for credits, so that those are where the platform for which credits are delivered or issued, I should say, to start, and then transferred and retired. And that's an important function of the registry to make sure that there's tracking of credits. So every credit on these registries is serialized, it has a number, and there's no double counting across registries. Off to the right here, this is just a very quick summary of developing a project. You've identified a project activity, you have a protocol that exists that's been adopted. If one doesn't exist ahead of this, you would develop that protocol. You would prepare listing documents, generate those, essentially the documents required to list your project on a registry. You would undertake your emission reduction activities or your practices that's defined in the protocol. You would develop a reporting period that would then, that would essentially, just like a financial audit, you're hiring an auditor or verifier, as they call it, to audit those emission reductions that have already occurred typically. And there's exceptions to that in certain programs like Climate Forward, but we can talk about that offline if there's any questions around that. Registry review, after a verifier has submitted the report, and then they issue findings that then, once closed out by the project proponent, then credits are issued, and then offsets can be then used in the marketplace. This process can take from beginning to end upwards to 18 months with the protocol, and even a longer 24 months to 36 months without a protocol. Once you've generated your offsets for the first year, it's typically an annual process thereafter. Okay. Next slide.
John, before we move on, would you mind giving kind of a high level example of what like a typical project would look like moving through this process?
Yeah, so an example of that would be, I'll just use landfill methane capture as an example, but there's many other types of projects. So a landfill project maybe is not voluntary or doesn't have a required system for capturing gas, and they are not required by any federal, local, or state requirements. They voluntarily install a gas collection system that is capturing gas that would otherwise go into atmosphere. There are protocols that exist on these registries that you can register that project with after you've implemented your gas collections or put in your gas collection system and define the reporting period. You then hire a verifier to come on site at that landfill to put eyes on the project, to review emission reduction calculations. There's a project design document that you have to submit. They're essentially going through and auditing, making sure that permits are up to date, that there is no out of compliance with not only the protocol, but existing laws and regulations. And then the verifier, that's typically a 4 to 6 month process of desktop review and site visit. And then once they are done with their review and you've closed out findings from them, that they're auditing you against the protocol, then they will issue a verification report to the registry. The registry will then review that report and issue their own findings. And then once that's done, credits can be then issued. That's the same for forestry. It's just different type of, or regen ag. It's essentially the same concept, but different project activities, different definitions of reduction activity and additionality and so forth. But that's essentially the process. Next slide. And I just want to be cognizant of time. I think I have about 4 minutes left. So this is just a snapshot of the registry. This is just showing an issuance of credits over time. And this is just the takeaway here is to say, hey, these registries are serializing numbers. There is a process for tracking and generating these credits. To the left, to the right, you have issued date, you have vintage, which is the year of which the reduction occurred, issued quantity, the reporting period that I talked about that gets verified and audited, and the serialized numbers off to the right. Okay, next slide. So the next part of this protocol or this presentation is really going to start focusing on market. So today, the market has fundamentally changed. It has, with ESG initiatives, environmental social governance, with corporate social responsibility, new goals, with financial institutions moving money over to ESG ratings and requirements for companies to be invested in and customer pressure, you've seen a huge amount of demand come from the market relative to previous years prior to 2016. So we talk about CEQA demand and things like that. That is an element of demand, but there's also this these other demand that's coming from a global perspective and from corporates, municipalities, and universities to meet certain goals. And that's really ESG. And that's part of what's really driving the demand today in offsets for voluntary offsets. Off to the right here, I've listed a few others. Corsia is the airline program. That is an example of a compliance program for airlines that will go on through 2030s. That will put millions of tons of demand into the market, or requirements for airlines to purchase voluntary offsets. So that's an example of a compliance market required by ICAO, allowing for voluntary offset markets to be used for compliance, which is important when we talk about CEQA. Paris Agreement, there is an Article 6 in there talking about offsets being used and traded among countries. And really we talk about here off to the bottom, federal legislation. What does that look like? We almost went there, or you can say we almost went there with Waxman and Markey under Obama administration in 2008, 2009. But usually the federal government is the slowest to move on carbon and decarbonization. But there is elements of that is happening, including in the regen ag space, where they're looking at ways to potentially create markets and incentives for groups. Okay. Next slide. So this chart here is to show, again, kind of to demonstrate and illustrate what I was talking about over time. If you look at the voluntary offset market over this 10-year period, or really this 15-year period, you would have seen essentially a very nascent kind of low liquidity market that's through 2015, 16. And you had a little bit of an uptick in 2008, 2009 with Waxman and Markey and other programs that existed around the world, but that essentially didn't pan out like everyone had hoped. So you had an oversupplied market for some time. And then starting in 2016, you started increasing the demand. So looking at this chart, you have issuances in dark blue and retirements in light blue. Those are both demand indicators. When a credit is issued in mini registry, that means there is a buyer receiving transfer of credits. A retirement obviously is your use of a credit, which is an obvious demand indicator. But in both of these cases, you can see that almost hyperbolic increase of volume of demand over time. If I were to finish this year after 2021, this goes through August 31st, you're talking about over 300 million tons transacted in the voluntary market, so voluntary specific, for 2021. And that's essentially, almost tripled the amount of liquidity, and also price with that as well. Okay, increased it in price though. So next slide. So here's the slide I always like to present with, especially with groups in CEQA, and I'm going to go through this within a minute. I'm running out of time here, but essentially the same thing that we looked at before, that you have issuances and retirements. What you had happen though in 2016 is you had retirements starting to exceed issuances. In 2021, this is essentially the only year over the last 4 or 5 years that issuances were not lower than retirements. And the reason for that is because there's a lot of groups that are starting to bank credits. Specifically for CEQA, there are, you might be, for demand in CEQA, there is geographical hierarchy and preference for some lead agencies. So sometimes we talk about a market focused in California. So what does the existing supply in California look like right now? It's for voluntary offset. It is very low. And the reason for that is because cap and trade offsets make up the majority of offsets that exist in California today. All right, and that creates competition between the voluntary offset markets. Today, we predict we forecast around 200,000 tons that are available for transaction today in California alone. So very low supply. There's 400,000 tons of FMUs, that's the Climate Forward program, that are forthcoming. We are forecasting roughly 15 to 20 million tons of CEQA demand in the California market right now, based upon EIRs and discussions and engagement with different developers. That is just what's been put on paper. That is not, and that's over 30 years, I should say. The expectation for what the demand will be in CEQA is much higher as we go through and run through some of the litigation that's happening, and this market becomes more visible and transparent as far as use for CEQA. So the takeaway there really is this, is that it is short supply in California with high demand expectations for California. So I'm way over time. I'm going to stop there, and thank you everyone for listening.
John, real quickly, I notice you're using an acronym that people may not be familiar with. Can you explain what FMU means?
Sorry, yeah, so that's a forecasted mitigation unit. And that is a type of credit implemented by one of the registries under the Climate Forward program. That is a type of credit they call it, which is ex ante, but basically you get issuance up front, and was really created by the SQL market and for essentially creating impact projects for reducing emissions. And so it is a forecasted mitigation unit that again is credits that are issued up front over the term of a crediting period of a project versus the ex post verification that I talked about on a reporting period basis of traditional offsets. Happy, if there's any questions offline, happy to go into specifics there.
Yes, we will definitely leave a lot of time for questions as they're starting to roll in. John, are you open to offering your, oh, here's your contact info.
Yeah, there it is.
And if I didn't mention it before, but we'll be offering up the recording of this webinar, and to the extent that we're able, we'll also be offering up the slide decks that are being offered up today. John, as I'm transitioning over to our next speaker, would you mind, there are some questions that are generally around costs of getting a project started, costs of verification, kind of costs of getting into market. Could you touch on that briefly?
Yeah, sure. So it varies based upon the product type. So a regen ag project is going to typically have a little bit higher OpEx costs for the monitoring requirements, to hire a verifier to audit that and review emission reduction calculations. But your primary costs for, other than actually the capital investment or any actually implementation costs for projects, which are again vary by product type, from landfill to forestry to regen ag to what have you. On the verification or accreditation side, a verification, your primary expenses are going to be the verifier on an annual basis, and the issuance fees associated with registries. The issuance fees range from 15 cents to 19 cents per credit. That's primarily how the registries make the nonprofit registries make their revenue. And then the verifiers are third-party auditors. It ranges. It can be as low as $10,000 per verification to as high as in the hundreds of thousands of dollars for large forestry projects.
Thank you, John. Another thing to note is, this is just another good segue to the second session of this series, which is focused on the supply side considerations of getting into carbon markets. And we'll hear also from someone who's a project developer. And so their primary role is to help facilitate getting carbon offset projects initiated and into the market through this process. So now, thank you, John. Now we're going to pivot to a different part of the discussion of how carbon offsets can play a role with climate action plans. And I'm going to turn it over to Michael Hendrix, who is the Air Quality and Climate Change Associate with LSA. Michael?
Good afternoon. I'm Michael Hendrix, and I am also the chair of the Association of Environmental Professionals Climate Change Committee. And the two follow-up speakers after me are also members of the Climate Change Committee. So great presence to have here. Next slide, please. So climate action plans are a critical component of the state getting to carbon neutrality. And the state's overarching goals and regulations are critical components to climate action plans achieving carbon neutrality. So it can't be underestimated the important work that climate action plans do and what we're doing collaboratively with the state, regionally, as well as local jurisdictions in climate action planning. Next slide, please. Climate action plans use carbon offsets for three basic purposes. One is local jurisdictions that these climate action plans cover cannot reduce GHG emissions down to net carbon neutrality on their own. They need some help. And that help is in providing some sinks or offsets through the carbon market. Carbon offsets are also useful as interim ways of reducing sector-specific emissions until technology catches up. So the use of natural gas is one place where essential land uses that are essential to the use of natural gas need to somehow offset those emissions. And then carbon offsets are also useful for new development projects within a climate action plan that want to achieve zero emission goals. They're going to need to do that with carbon offsets. Next slide, please. So there's two types of what we call offsets, the formal offsets that John just went through, and then a more informal, often people call them offsets, but they would be implementing community level reductions off-site of a project, but within a climate action plan. So these two types of carbon offsets are typical in a climate action plan, and I'll go through some examples of both types. We'll start with the off-site community level reductions. Next slide. So off-site community level reduction measures do not have the same administrative rigor as carbon credits in the voluntary market. All of those checks and balances and verification that John talked about, none are actually required within a climate action plan. It is up to the local jurisdiction how they administer it. Local jurisdictions do track their reduction measures within a climate action plan that's required of CEQA, but not to the rigor that the carbon market does. And oddly enough, the courts support community level reduction measures, whereas they've been skeptical, very skeptical, and Brian and Rich will kind of highlight that, of the use of carbon credits, the use of off-site community reduction measures within a climate action plan is widely embraced by the courts. So I find that a little ironic. Next slide, please. So there are basically two types that typically show up in a climate action plan. One is a community level electric vehicle infrastructure implementation plan. So this community level electric vehicle infrastructure implementation plan really focuses in on electrifying the fleet within a local jurisdiction. Next slide, please. These plans will evaluate the existing land uses within the city, county, or region that is within the sphere of the climate action plan that require electric vehicles charging stations to better serve the electric vehicles within that community. And they will look at those land uses, these existing land uses. There's not a lot of hooks that they can require these land uses to provide electric vehicle charging, but there certainly is a need for it. They'll generally have GIS mapping of the locations where they'd like to target for electric vehicle charging stations. And obviously the implementation requires funding. And because of that, new development projects are sometimes looked at as a way of getting that funding. So the climate action plan may require new development, particularly if it has a large emission profile, to offset some of its emissions off-site after it's done everything that it can on-site, and provide the funding to actually build these charging stations at the location. And then it's up to the jurisdiction itself to track where they've been put and triage which ones are most in need. One other thing I'd say about an example of an electric vehicle infrastructure plan, South Bay Cities Council of Governments in their regional climate action plan had an electric vehicle infrastructure plan for El Segundo and Carson and a few other environmental justice communities, where they not only had the chargers, but they had on loan electric vehicles, small electric vehicles that were locked into these chargers, and residents of these neighborhoods could actually through an app, unlock those and borrow the car, if you will, and put it back on the charger when it's done. So that was one way that a Southern California regional COG had implemented a community-wide reduction measure that actually benefited an environmental justice community in a way. Next slide, please. So another common community-wide effort within a climate action plan is an urban forestry plan. It evaluates the existing tree canopy within the city and where there's need for more trees. And this gets very complex because in addition to having the tree canopy to provide shade, reduce the urban heat island effect, and sequester carbon, they also need to be mindful of not shading solar panels, providing line of sight on the streets and street signage and traffic lights, that kind of thing. These are also GIS mapped, looking at where the best places are to plant additional trees. Implementation and maintenance also requires funding. So this is another opportunity that new development projects may be required to do some offsite mitigation by putting in the irrigation infrastructure and the trees that are needed to fulfill the urban forestry plan. Now, this picture of this one neighborhood is what we'd all like to see all the residential neighborhoods looking like. But if you go to the next slide, we have a picture of a more urban area and low income. So you can see the challenges there are to actually having an urban forestry plan work well within the city throughout the city. So low income communities tend to lack tree canopies, and this is a good example of that. The co-benefits of tree canopies are as important or more important often to the jurisdiction than the carbon sequestration itself. Often the urban forestry plan, when you take into account the energy needed to provide the irrigation water and maintenance for the urban forest canopy, the sequestration portion of it is pretty much a wash. But there's additional benefits as far as reducing the heat island effect, improving the air quality of areas, improving the mental health of just wanting to be in these communities that are very important to local jurisdictions. Next slide, please. So I just talked about two examples of what we call offsite reduction measures. Climate action plans also use carbon credits within the voluntary markets to ensure that the CAP achieves its goals. And some of those are sector specific offsets meant to offset a particular sector that they cannot reduce on their own. And the other is the general use of offsets to ensure that the CAP reduction targets are met. Next slide, please. So a couple of examples of a sector-specific carbon offset is biogas credits, methane capture credits, what John talked about as far as renewable natural gas credits that can be used to offset the use of natural gas in certain industrial processes. Now, industrial processes, if they're large enough, are captured under the cap and trade program, but there are a myriad of small kilns and furnaces that are in use for industrial or commercial processes such as ceramic kilns, dental offices, laboratories that use natural gas and need to use natural gas and need to offset that somehow. Another place that we're recently seeing, particularly in Southern California and what they call the Inland Empire, is the need to offset supply chain logistics. Supply chain logistics, basically heavy duty diesel trucks going from the Port of LA, Port of Long Beach to points east. And we are finding in some climate action plans requiring logistic warehousing have interim offsets until an electric truck fleet is ready to roll. And what they do there is they will provide the conduit, the wiring, and the capacity for the chargers for the trucks, but then on a yearly basis, offset the emissions until that truck fleet is actually on the road and delivering product either to the port or taking a product from the port. Next slide. And I believe this is my closing slide. I went through this really fast to kind of catch up. It is vitally important that we achieve carbon neutrality. And to do that, we are going to need offsets of different types. Climate action plans are one means of doing that. And certainly at a project level, Brian and Rich will get into the details there. But with that, I'll turn it over to you guys.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. We are going to keep moving along so that we were able to get all the presentations in and still leave time for questions. We're going to be pivoting now back to the issues around offsite credits as CEQA mitigation. And with that, I'm going to be turning it over to Brian Schuster. He is the Senior Managing Associate at ESA. And Brian, if you just give me a moment to look at the slide deck up, but you can go ahead and start off with your introduction.
Thanks, Garrett. And hey, everybody. Thanks so much for sharing your afternoon with us. Really appreciate it, everybody joining today. As Garrett mentioned, I'm Brian Schuster with ESA. I specialize in air quality and climate change. I help manage ESA's climate action planning practice and serve as technical director for air quality and greenhouse gas analyses under CEQA. Just quickly about ESA, we're a 100% employee-owned firm. We've been around for 50 years. CEQA is our bread and butter. We do all kinds of other things like planning, design, restoration, et cetera. So I'll jump into it. I'm going to just share a couple of slides on the use of offset credits as CEQA mitigation, and then Rich Walter will follow talking more about CEQA, case law, pitfalls, pros and cons, all that stuff. So next slide. First question, can GHG offset credits be used as CEQA mitigation? The answer is yes, but there are plenty of caveats, of course, as there always are. Just a couple of notes here to the CEQA guidelines. This one, 15126, is pretty clear. Offset measures, including offsets that are not otherwise required, can be used to mitigate a project's GHG emissions. Of course, it's more complex than that, as Rich will go into with some of the case law that we've encountered over the last couple of years. But the idea of an offset is valid under CEQA, provided that the mitigation measure, meets all of CEQA's requirements for mitigation. AB 900 is a judicial streamlining bill under CEQA, which requires projects to achieve no net additional GHG emissions, essentially net zero. These are CARB basically not verified, but CARB approved applications to achieve this net zero. And every single AB 900 project approved by CARB up to date has required the use of offset credits to meet that standard. So CARB is supportive of the use of offset credits under CEQA, but again, there are plenty of things you got to do if you're going to use it as a mitigation measure. And then final Natural Resources Agency, their final statement of reasons on the CEQA guidelines in 2009 also support the use of credits in CEQA. So just a bit of foundation there. Next slide. When can we use offset credits in CEQA? Basically, after you do everything on site, that's the recommendation. Mitigate, project design, reduce your emissions to the maximum extent feasible, given technology, financing, project objectives, et cetera. And only after all feasible on-site local emission reduction measures are incorporated should you consider offsets. This isn't a rule, it's a strong recommendation. It is in CEQA guidelines as well, sort of identifying that. You need to quantify your project's emissions and then reduce on-site to the maximum extent that you can. EV charging, all electric buildings, renewable electricity, et cetera. And then finally, if additional reductions are needed to get to your significance threshold, whatever that may be, offsets can be used to close that gap. Next slide. What's the level of detail that's an offset mitigation measure needs to meet under CEQA? Well, more and more as the days go by. Every new court case, we're adding paragraphs to our offset mitigation measures. But at the very basic level, we need some sort of quantification. How many offset credits are needed? What assumptions are we using to calculate the gap to the offsets? Do we need to reassess annually or every couple of years the project's emissions to calculate that residual amount to get to your threshold or your performance standard for the project? It needs that piece. There's an agreement, a contract essentially between the applicant, lead agency, the registry, CARB, whoever's involved with conducting the offset project, the voluntary registry, any additional third parties that may be involved. It's some lead agencies like to hire their own expert outside of a registry to basically double up on third party verification. So contracting is really important, binding agreements. Thirdly, confirmation and validation. So what kind of standards are applied, what registries are allowed, what locations are preferred, what are the credentials of the verifiers, all of the nuts and bolts of the objective performance criteria for offsets. A lot of that's contained within the protocols, the registry protocols. So your mitigation measure needs to talk about those. And then finally, reporting and monitoring. It's just like any mitigation monitoring plan. Is the mitigation measure being effective? Have we purchased enough and retired enough offsets? Do we need to buy more? Can we bank some from a previous year? Do we need to true up the project as vehicles get cleaner, electricity gets cleaner, maybe new technologies come online and we don't need as many offsets? Annual reporting and to ensure that your performance goals and your offsets and your other mitigation measures are working is really important. Next slide. Just a couple more slides. So you should use GHG offsets as mitigation. Of course, and like any mitigation, it really is up to the lead agency to determine the effectiveness of a mitigation measure based on substantial evidence. And I think although there's lots of skepticism around offsets and uncertainty for certain protocols, I mean, we're not glazing over that, and we'll get to some of the questions that I've seen pop up in the chat regarding those issues. The registries are very robust. Offsets are things that have occurred in the past. Some protocols do have risk of reversal and permanence issues, but generally that's not as big of a concern as most people may think. But of course, there are issues and they're not perfect, just like any mitigation measure. Other reasons you should use offsets: it supports an aggressive threshold of significance. If you're not sure what threshold to pick, if your air district hasn't adopted a GHG threshold, or your lead agency doesn't know what to do, like what's significant, what's not, well, you can choose 0, which is a pretty clear level of lessen or even no impact, and offsets can help you get there. It encourages projects to be very low GHG. Offsets can be cost effective and feasible. The prices vary, as John mentioned, and they're likely to change in the future, but generally speaking, offsets are cost-effective way of reducing 1 ton of CO2e. And they're widely available, at least in the US and North America, and of course, internationally. California, the market is very limited, as John mentioned, but nationally and continentally, there's lots of availability. Next slide. Just an example here. This is the Oakland A's ballpark, a mixed use project, the new West Oakland A's ballpark land use development. The EIR was just certified by the board of directors a few months ago. This project is a net zero project. The special legislation that passed for this project, AB 734, required not only that the project achieve net zero emissions, but also that at least 50% of the reductions have to be local. That's either on-site or neighborhood measures. Because West Oakland is a highly burdened community from toxic air pollution, you got the port, you have multiple freeways, you have ocean-going vessels, you have rail, lots of heavy duty trucks, as many local programs as possible to achieve that 50% standard have to be implemented. And then the remainder can be achieved through offsets. And that's written into the final EIR for this project, those offsets, along with the on-site. Next slide. Last slide. You should not use GHG offsets as CEQA mitigation. On the flip side of the coin, this is a very delicate balance, and Rich is going to get into more of this, but offsets as a mitigation measure need to be very detailed, very specific, very objective. There need to be specific performance criteria for offsets, timing, contracts, all those things I mentioned before. There are environmental justice concerns, of course, including the local co-benefits. If your offset is not local, the community is not going to see those benefits. That's not a GHG impact issue, but it is a public health issue. It's a policy issue. It's an environmental justice issue. These are really important issues, and can't be ignored. They go hand in hand with GHG reduction. So this is one concern, and a valid concern, that a lot of people raise. Local offsets are scarce and can be expensive. So if that's your priority, then it may not be possible to mitigate locally. There is some risk of reversal on the forestry side, and I won't go into detail because I'm not an expert on these things, but the offset registries do have buffer pools and other backstops to cover any reversals. But there are some valid concerns as far as permanence go for certain offset projects. Others, like landfill methane capture, it's not as much of a concern. Enforcement authority, of course, beyond the lead agency, going to a registry, going to a third-party verifier, lots of people involved who are doing various things. So making sure you identify those folks, and all of the criteria for involving them are spelled out in your mitigation measure. And then finally, there is some legal risk of deferral, feasibility issues, and enforcement. Offsets have to meet the feasibility and other criteria of CEQA. So you can't just say we're going to offset and be done with it. You have to really go through the motions of complying with all the CEQA requirements for mitigation. And that's the end of my presentation, and Rich will take this to the next step. So thank you.
Great. Awesome. Thank you, Brian. And thank you for catching us up a little bit. And I will quickly transition over to Rich Walter from ICF. Rich is the Vice President of Environmental Planning. And Rich, again, as I'm queuing up your slide, feel free to go ahead and kick it off with your introduction.
Yeah, thanks, Garrett. I'll try to go quickly through a number of the challenges, but also some opportunities that I see for offset providers, Central Coast or elsewhere. So one of the reasons you have heard us talking about CEQA, a number of them, is that the demand for CEQA for offsets isn't only from people who are going to get an approval for new development and have to go through the CEQA process, but also corporate sustainability efforts and other efforts that are out there, climate action plans, and so on. But it is a potentially large and growing market because the demands to mitigate under CEQA are getting tougher and tougher. And that's one of the reasons we talk about it a bit. You know, if you're interested in doing an offset program, that, compliance with CEQA may not, except for your own project, may not be the biggest, but it is an important driver in California of potential demand for offsets, which creates a market which is really important to the viability. So diving in, next slide. You may have heard that there have been some court rulings, and you may have heard them characterized as being against the use of offsets, particularly under CEQA. And usually what people are referring to is something called the Golden Door 2 ruling. The Golden Door is a very expensive spa in northern San Diego County. It's had a lot of fights from them to stop development that's next door. And in the process, they have filed numerous lawsuits against the county, including on the potential to use greenhouse gas offsets or credits as mitigation. So some of the things that the court said are listed here. Won't go into them too much, but they were criticizing it that the mitigation was not equivalent to the cap and trade system, didn't necessarily require CARB approved protocols, had no constraint on using greenhouse gas credits from outside of California or perhaps internationally, didn't have an express additionality requirement, and delegated some critical decisions to the planning director, who may not necessarily be qualified to make some decisions about the adequacy of offsets. In my opinion, some of the things that they criticized about the mitigation were appropriate. Some of them were flagrantly wrong in judgment and in science. But the reaction of the market to this is to make better mitigation that pretty much addresses every one of the issues in it. Next slide. And though the court criticized the use of it, they actually went out of their way to say, to be abundantly clear, this decision is not intended to be a blanket prohibition on using carbon offsets, even those outside of California, to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions under CEQA. So the ruling did not preclude the use of it. I would say it made us tighten up our belts and to make sure that we have really rigorous mitigation language that really matches the professional practice of offset protocols and offset practice to make sure this is real mitigation. So there's also the Association of Environmental Professionals has published on this and spoken on this, and we're hoping that we can keep this as a potential tool for CEQA compliance, which would also increase the market demand for offsets in California and elsewhere. Next slide. So some of this Brian has said before is that it's actually, they are allowed by CEQA. It's not been eliminated. Some recommendations just to reinforce some of the things that Brian had said. Definitely use, proper, well-developed, long experienced registries and protocols. You can reference some of the objective criteria for determining validity. These are the things like real and additional and permanent that are used commonly in protocols. Make sure and reference those. Have performance standards, discuss whether you have a locational priority or not. Most places, when they're requiring these under CEQA, they're saying, okay, look local first, and then look in the county, and then look in the region, and then look in the state, and then only then maybe look outside the state, and if outside the country, then look internationally. Make sure that there's decision-making by individuals with expertise. So there are people who are accredited and trained in doing this, who may not be the planning director, but most likely will not be. There is going to be some continued controversy about their use in CEQA, so I wouldn't say that's resolved, even though I think we have good answers for that in practice. And critically, there is a very important social issue that does derive about it, and that's really focused on environmental justice. Next slide. So there's been a long debate. I'll get into the environmental justice in a moment, but just following up a little bit, the biggest debate in the environmental justice world relative to greenhouse gas offsets is where do they occur? And there's a lot of criticism that they don't necessarily occur in the place where the emissions occur. Does that matter as far as global warming? Not really. It's a well-distributed gas in the atmosphere, and it affects the global climate. So you can mitigate in a different location when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions from the location where the greenhouse gases are emitted. So as far as greenhouse gases is concerned, location doesn't really matter. However, you can express priorities. Local governments can certainly use priorities to express their policy differences. And there are some fineries about the statewide targets, but as long as the credits are additional, they're still helping the state to reduce its emissions, even if sometimes that might be outside the state. Next slide, please. But as a social and policy matter, this has been a concern about the statewide, the cap and trade program, which is only for regulated entities, large fuel providers and industrial sources, power plants, things like that. The big concern there is not so much the greenhouse gas emissions, the CO2, for example, that might be emitted locally, but when you emit CO2 at a power plant, you're also emitting other air pollutants that have a more localized regional effect, not just the global effect that you might have from CO2. So the concern has been when you approve a project, and you allow it to mitigate the greenhouse gas somewhere else, you don't get the co-benefits locally. So if you, in the advocate's point of view, if you had to lower all the emissions locally, including the greenhouse gas emissions, then you would likely be reducing ozone precursors or particulates or other things that do affect local health. So it's a very much a policy issue. It hasn't quite gotten to be a CEQA issue yet, but it may in the future get there. So this is an important issue for local governments, to some extent the state government, to continue to act on. Outside of CEQA, perfectly fair, you know, a lot of general plans are including an environmental justice element now. So this may be something that they want to consider in there. And you saw the example from Brian's project with the Oakland A's, where they were prioritizing, what, 50% to bring that local, to kind of balance between the flexibility that offsets can provide, but also having some sensitivity to those local issues. Next slide. And there is a law pending in the legislature right now that has to do with two different aspects, but they're somewhat related. And one, I won't go through it all. This is called AB 1001. And one is prioritizing local mitigation of air quality effects. And the second is to actually bring in environmental justice into the practice of CEQA. So this would change things pretty substantial. There is a relation to these issues of offset credits. I would also plug that there is a AEP Institute focused on environmental justice and greenhouse gas offset credits that's coming up in June. And it's going to do a whole day just on that issue to focus in on it. Next slide. So those are a couple challenges, and I want to finish out with some of the drivers for the demand. And John McDougal gave it his estimate of where the demand is right now in CEQA. And this was kind of a think piece that I did, just looking out to 2030 and 2045, if all projects were that all new development were subject to greenhouse gas reduction requirements. And it shows, and these are also 30-year lifetimes. So this isn't necessarily each year per se, but it's a total out to 2030 or 2045 of the potential market, which is in the hundreds of millions of tons up to very high hundreds of millions, depending on it. The actual demand is probably much lower than these numbers. It just shows you the theoretical amount of demand, should this become common in CEQA, is quite large. Next slide. The other is Senate Bill 27, which was just passed last year. The state is going to establish a carbon sequestration and climate resiliency project registry. This would provide an opportunity for project proponents who have offset projects that involve sequestration on natural and working lands, which is a big focus of this seminar series, that they could list that up there to publicize it, to seek funding from either the state or private entities for their project. And they have a series of criteria that they are looking to vet proposals. And if they pass all that criteria, then they'll put it up on the registry that the state is establishing by next year. Next slide. And then finally, this is some of the math behind the scoping plan. The scoping plan is the state's strategy for moving greenhouse gas reductions forward. And they're looking right now in the new scoping plan that'll be coming out soon about strategies to get to carbon neutrality or near to carbon neutrality by 2045. And what this slide shows is that if you look on the right in the graph at the 2045 bars, you'll see a number of things above the line. These are the residual emissions under different scenarios, that they're finding that pragmatically, we're probably not going to eliminate all emissions. And they're looking at a range of different, severities in terms of how they implement reductions overall. But they're still going to have, 100 to 200 million remaining, depending on scenario, metric tons at the state level. And then that below the line on 2045, kind of the gray hatched, is carbon dioxide removal. That would either come through carbon sequestration on natural and working lands, or through direct air capture, which is sort of a new technology that's coming out. So this is another driver, is that if the state is saying that we're not going to be able to eliminate all emissions. We can get them way down, but to get to carbon neutrality, we're going to have to invest heavily in carbon sequestration and perhaps some of these new mechanical removal technologies. That is also a market driver for project proponents that might be looking at to do sequestration in their ranching or their farming or other natural land investments. Next slide. I think that's mine. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rich. And thank you to all of our speakers. We definitely have a number of questions coming in from the audience, so we'll try and get to a significant amount of them, but ones that we don't get to through today's session, we'll do our best to follow up with written responses that we'll also be able to share following this series. So I'm gonna start out with a heavy one. So in the beginning, we got a comment calling out a recent study from UC Berkeley that found that a significant number of offset credits issued by ARB under the forest projects offset protocol shows that over 80% of those credits generated by these projects likely do not represent the true emission reductions. And there was another comment from another participant, again, kind of touching on bogus carbon credits or lack of additionality. So wanted to put that out there and see who wants to take that one first.
I'll jump in on that one. Familiar with the study and familiar with the authors there. What I would say about that is that the offset protocols. I think if you look at the responses from ARB, if you look at the responses from the registries, they very concretely and objectively addressed those concerns with the way that the monitoring plan is set up in the protocols for forestry, the way that additionality is demonstrated, the requirements for putting conservation easements in place and giving up harvest rights. So what I would say to that is where there was an argument for that from Berkeley, I think that if you dig a little deeper, it's not that clean cut. It is very difficult and challenging to generate an offsets from a forestry project. They have to go through very rigorous standards, and there is defense in the additionality and permanence of offsets for forestry. Happy to elaborate on that.
The only thing I would add is that good to read the Berkeley study, and good to read the response to it that CARB has provided. They're both available on the web, and that'll really get you into. You'll fast find that the details really matter, not necessarily the top line headline, but when you go into that, it's a matter of choices that are made in developing a protocol, in applying it, in the monitoring, as John said. But it is a complex world, the protocol world. But I find that most times when and there have been. The greenhouse gas market, offset market started in the 90s, nominally speaking. Maybe John knows that it started earlier, given his knowledge, but there have been problems internationally, not everywhere internationally, but in certain types of protocols that have been used. So it's not to say that there aren't challenges in coming up with good protocols and doing it over time. But I find that when I go into some of the critics' claims about that, it is much more complex in terms of the details. And so I would just encourage people to look at them.
And one last thing I'd add is don't just go by the news articles, look at the papers themselves and the responses, because the news likes to make headlines. And I think that creates a little bit of misunderstanding, if you will.
Well, I think that speaks to a couple other issues that people have raised, having expertise, third-party verifiers, folks who are involved in project development and getting projects to market who are quote unquote unbiased. And how do you, when you're thinking about a project, how do you think of the order of magnitude when you're thinking about your budget and all the overhead costs that go into it before you realize you have a viable project? And then where can you get funding for that if you're not yet getting paid for those offsets?
Sure, I'll jump in on that one as well. So the typical practice for identifying a project activity is to run a feasibility study with a group that is familiar with protocols and the process flow. Certainly we do that in-house. And then from there, you're looking at, just like anything, what's the cost benefit analysis? What are my CapEx? What is my OpEx? And seeing what the market value of those credits will be. And then there's different structures out there for funding, which can include offtake of credits. So what they call prepay or unit contingent contracts upon delivery that can help you get funding from banks or what have you. But that's all part of the kind of the different practitioners in offset world. And that's, just to be completely frank, what we do. So.
Great, thank you. We have one participant who's been patiently waiting, who raised their hand. Laurel Barton, I'll allow you to talk.
I don't think I raised my hand on purpose. I'm sorry. I'm just
Okay.
listening.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
All right then. We have a question. Question was, can banking offsets lead to market manipulation? So can people buy offsets, not retire them, and essentially manipulate market prices?
So no, I mean, the offsets, if you look at cap and trade programs across the world, the idea of cap and trade and offsets is that it's a fungible product. It becomes a commodity or credit that's memorialized and minted. If you're talking about any kind of hoarding or what have you, I mean, that exists potentially in any market, right? I haven't seen that to date, and I would say that generating offsets and not monetizing them or holding them and buying them, there's market risk with that, right? You could hold an offset, you could bank a credit, and just like any traditional commodity market, that market could go down. Now, we haven't seen that for years because it's been oversupplied, but we've had demand really hit hard and create incentive for new supply, and pricing has gone up. But eventually that'll settle out. So like any market, they'll have risk for banking.
Thank you, John. One other hand raised. I'd like to call on Aisha.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I don't know exactly who should answer this question, probably a mix of you, but Michael first came to mind. So I'm up here in Humboldt County, and we are in the process of finalizing our multi-jurisdictional climate action plan. And we have a lot of redwood trees up here. A lot of it is already being claimed as carbon offsets by private landowners. However, there are some lands, both forest lands and other natural and working lands that have potential. And the jurisdictions naturally want to eventually be able to count those sequestration projects or the sequestration potential towards their GHG reduction goals. Our understanding, and this is kind of where I'm wondering if our understanding is correct, is that in order to actually count those projects towards GHG reduction goals, you have to have them designated as a project that goes through the registry process, and then can generate offsets. Then the other bit is that we would actually need to conduct an inventory. So then over time, we could have a good idea of what the reductions actually are, rather than just let's figure out the potential and then we'll just count it towards the goals without having a baseline. So just curious if any of you are able to speak to that, or if I'm getting any of that wrong. I know it's a pretty beefy question, but you all seem like amazing experts. So I wanted to throw the question out there.
I'll start with the climate action planning perspective, which is probably the least technical and administrative of all of them. Part of that is those trees were there in your existing conditions. So hopefully you've counted them as part of your assets, if you will. And in the baseline inventory actually showed the sequestration that is occurring with those. If you haven't, then that is a potential for additional reductions. It sounds great that you have an active and healthy redwood forest. What I was speaking to on the climate action planning side was areas that may not have enough tree canopy cover and suffer from a heat island effect. I don't think that's your problem. Also, a good thing about this is that it sounds like these are natural redwood trees. You're not irrigating or in any way assisting in them. So there's actually real sequestration potential. Getting into how you would calculate it, yeah, you would have to verify the sequestration, not just figure out the potential, but also verify that. And I'll let John or some others get into the details of that.
I was going to give someone else a chance to respond, but yeah, in general, there are foresters and auditors out there that can verify credits either via offsets, the registered offsets that we talked about, or even just doing a greenhouse gas inventory or sequestration analysis. And that's really in the realm of the forestry sector. And there's groups out there that can do that.
Yeah, I think we have time for, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead to the next one.
I'll say, I think we have time for a few more questions and we're likely not going to get to all of them, but what is the present feasibility of mechanical removal? It was already mentioned, direct air capture. Can you talk about that a little bit?
It's not widely used at present. I've seen quotes in the few recent years that running about $500 to $600 a ton. But those are often quotes from people who are project proponents. So it's not widely used at present. You know, just to use that, to take that number as a real number, that you could compare that to what John presented in terms of current prices in the market, whether it's in Europe or the US, and whether it's on the voluntary or the compliance market, where you're anywhere from, let's say, $6 to $70 a ton. So right now it's not economically feasible. It just doesn't compete in the market. So I've heard claims that with technology development they might get that down to $100 a ton. Then you know, if they are successful in that could become competitive. But one would think that you would want to, from an efficiency point of view, would you want to go through all the things first that are less costly and that have already been shown to be more efficient at this point. But if we sucked up all the other ones and then we're left with that, well, then maybe that will go. John, do you want to add anything? You probably touched on this.
Yeah, so I mean, exactly right. It's very nascent technology. There's a lot of an interest in investing in it. It's low yield for the dollar per ton marginal cost. So, you know, Rich gave some numbers there. You know, very high cost. There is one that exists today in the US that's participating in the LCFS market, which is a much higher price compliance market. That's also being supported by United. But it is very nascent, very fledgling technology. There's a lot of interest to bring it on, but not quite there yet. And not to be confused with carbon capture and storage, which there is a lot of interest in doing that. It's not the same thing. That is avoidance and sequestration and you know, putting into the ground into geological formations. That is certainly a lot of interest in being incentivized by the federal government and offsets.
Great. I'm gonna
go ahead.
I'm gonna move on to one last question, which kind of gets at a few questions I think from several people in terms of natural landscape or natural land management or regenerative agriculture, has been mentioned, land stewardship. We have some folks who are talking about taking row crops out of production, planting trees, or doing something on rangelands. Can you talk a little bit about how those kinds of projects can be viable?
Yeah, so the regenerative ag is really was all the craze a couple years ago, and has continued to be of interest given the wide the number of acres that we have in the U.S., North America, really in general, where you can implement practices, everything from no-till to grazing practices to fertilizer amendments, and to be able to monitor that effectively with protocols that are currently being reviewed and going through adoption process, both on Barrier and Climate Action Reserve. So yes, they are viable. There are groups that are generating volumes. It is the name of the game there really is scale, aggregation, and then those credits typically do sell at a premium to other offset projects to cover the marginal cost and to realize a profit margin.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much to all of our speakers. I really appreciate you sharing your time and expertise with us today. I hope everyone here on the call got something out of it, but there definitely is more ahead of us in this series as we move on into next week's session, which will be on Wednesday, focusing on the supply side considerations. So getting a little bit deeper into some of the questions that were posed here, we'll be hearing from an actual carbon registry representative from Climate Action Reserve. We'll also be hearing from another registry called NORI, which works specifically in the voluntary market space and regenerative agriculture offsets. And then we'll also be hearing from an organization called Climate Trust, which can be considered a project developer, so someone who can help provide the technical assistance in facilitating your carbon offset project and getting it to market. Please stay tuned for the next sessions, and again, we'll be following up with making available the recordings, the slides, questions with responses, and you can find that all at centralcoastclimate.org/sequestration, which we will also put in the chat and follow up with everybody following this presentation. So want to thank everyone for making the time today, this afternoon, to participate, and we look forward to engaging with you in the following weeks. Thank you.